Welcome back, everyone. In this module, we're going to review visual design components that help deliver on the surface plane. First and foremost, contrast and uniformity. We spoke about priority and hierarchy, and contrast and uniformity are ways to deliver on that, to make sure that your user sees the important things first. Contrast is a first principle in graphic design, so it shouldn't be a surprise that it ends up in our list here. We use this to help our experience. So why is contrast a good thing? As I mentioned, without contrast, how else do you create priority and hierarchy? How can you influence a user to decide on one versus the other if you don't create contrast between those two elements? Also, why do we need uniformity? Why is uniformity important? If everything is different, then nothing is the same, and there isn't priority and hierarchy. Creating an easy to understand interface starts by understanding what's most important to the user. The use of good contrast and uniformity allow us to do that and execute on it in visual design. To explain this a little further, I want to make sure that everyone understands that uniformity is not sameness. It's just consistency. It's consistency in button shapes. It's consistency in typography size. It's consistency in color use. Uniformity allows us to see similar components on different pages and understand what they do almost immediately. Consistency applies to all branding elements, button sizes, shadows, stroke thickness. Any visual design component should have consistent use. So incorporating contrast and uniformity into your design system is quite essential. Further, consistency across media helps make the brand message tight and easier to understand. If your design system is established with great contrast and uniformity, and you use it across different media, then your brand message rings loud and clear to users. They understand who you are at first glance. And we use these artifacts to help us make the visual layout accessible across media. You immediately can understand that the brand that you recognize and love is the same on print, television, websites, and mobile applications. And as we discussed in the skeleton plane, grid-based layouts taken from print allow us to create contrast and uniformity across platforms. The next element of our design system is color. Color is also one of the first principles in graphic design. And the creation of a color palette is central to the brand message, and therefore central to the experience being designed. Most clients have brand colors, primary, secondary, and tertiary at very least. Their use may also be dictated by a brand guide. What you have to determine is how do those colors translate into the digital space? What can be used and what can't? We have to consider accessibility, readability, visibility, and the contrast of using those colors with white or black type. Color is central to a brand message. And if I asked you what color is central to the brand message of Coca-Cola, I'm sure you would say red. For McDonald's, some of you may gravitate directly towards the golden arches, yellow being that primary color, and some may think immediately about red, the brand color of most of their packaging. And Gap, of course, comes to mind as another primary color use, blue being their prominent one. And we use color specifically to establish uniformity and priority, i.e. contrast. Using colors juxtaposed against each other will draw attention to specific elements of our design. Common color conventions should be considered as well. For example, from infancy, we are taught that red means stop, green means go. Those are things we need to take into account. And it's those semiotic uses, those signifiers in the digital space that encourage or discourage our interaction. When we determine a color palette for our digital experiences, we need to understand what color communicates. And color can be juxtaposed against photography and illustration to mean different things than if it's used on a blank canvas. In these three examples, what does color communicate to you? I'll post this photo in an exercise following this module. Please put down a few points that reflect what color communicates in each one of these instances. Color can be used quite well throughout experiences. And most of the time in digital experiences, color is used in a subtle way. On the right of this image, we see the color palette that was established during the design phase. And on the left, of course, is that home page, that landing page, that experience that was created. Here's another example where the color palette was fairly neutral, but when applied, came to life in the digital design. And a rich color palette needs a lot of attention. Juxtaposed against white type allows the priority to be the message, and the color palette blends into the background. And this lighter pastel color palette provides a different experience altogether from the bold colors in the previous example. Color tells a brand's story and can be used prominently or subtly to create contrast and uniformity. Color tells a brand's story and can be used to communicate many different things. You just need to determine how best to use the colors that are part of your client's brand. The next element of our visual design toolkit is typography. Typography, of course, means fonts, font faces, font styles, and the uses of those fonts throughout our experience. Typography is, again, a print design fundamental. We understand these elements from the physical space, from graphic design. We do also need to understand that not all fonts can be utilized or look great on a digital screen. There are better fonts for digital screens that can read better on smaller, medium, large size screens. So make sure you do your research and determine the best application for the fonts that you're handed. If you have carte blanche on choosing fonts, then look for great font pairings that are very readable and very recognizable. Familiarity or not could be the direction that you want to take your brand. Now, using image as text is not the answer anymore. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's unavoidable. If it's in a brand mark or a word mark, you'll have to use image as text and not render it as HTML. There are also other exceptions to that rule when it comes to media that needs to be created really quickly, or the positioning of specific text needs to sit in a specific way. As much as there are those exceptions, layout in the digital space is as much about code as it is design. And if you use a great screen design software tool, you should avoid creating something that can't be reproduced in code. When we determine typography, we need to think about brand elements like color, contrast, and uniformity as well. How do you communicate through fonts? And what font would you choose for these specific images that we show on this slide? Following this module, I'll also ask, what typography treatment would you add to these images that reflect the feeling you get when you see them? And how does it pair with the feeling you get related to the color choices? Both of those questions will be part of the same exercise. Typography does have some rules. Using typography to infer contrast is good, meaning that if you have the opportunity, pairing different fonts together can create an interesting design palette. But be sure to keep it simple, especially if you're designing for small screens, because there isn't enough space to really create large-scale contrast between typography elements. If you are going to pair fonts together, make sure you choose ones that complement each other. And be consistent in your use of these fonts. If you're going to use one of the fonts for headers and the other for body copy, make sure that that stays consistent everywhere that you use those fonts in your design system. Now, following the rules is important, but there are those that understand the rules and deliberately decide to break them. And here are a few print examples where typography rules have been completely thrown out of the window. And that wraps up our module on visual design components. We'll see you in the next one.